All right, everyone, welcome again to another edition of Art Brunch, where, of course, we explore the wisdom of the arts, spirituality, and the great ideas. We are continuing with part 4 of our series on myth and religion, the good, the bad, and the ugly. So hopefully you are enjoying it so far. Now, since 9/11, our attitude about religious martyrdom, in particular, has changed, I think. We used to view religious martyrs either favorably or rather indifferently. We maybe thought they were a little crazy, but we didn't have intense negative views. Maybe some of us thought it foolish to die for one's religious faith. But now, since 9/11, some of us may find the whole idea of martyrdom repulsive. Now, last week I introduced these martyrs of philosophy and science: Hypatia of Alexandria, Socrates, and Giordano Bruno. Now, based on comments at both the Zoom and the in-person gatherings, I believe the consensus was their sacrifice was ultimately unwise, considering what greater contributions they could have made if they had compromised a little bit their commitment to truth-telling and told the authorities what they wanted. Then they would have been able to continue their research and gift it to humanity. We saw that Galileo did just that. But I also introduced this famous statement from MLK Jr. last week, and I'll remind you of it again. If you've got nothing worth dying for, you've got nothing worth living for. Now, I don't know about you, but I'm still wrestling with that quote, with the idea of living for a truth or value or principle so significant that I would die for it. Now, it's one thing to agree with Martin Luther King Jr. His words sound lofty and noble, but it's a whole other matter to actually believe it when a sword is hovering above our neck. Now, for this presentation, I spent quite some time looking for martyrs across the religious and cultural spectrum. And strangely, or at least to my surprise, nearly all of the material on religious martyrs specifically focuses on Christian martyrs. A very distant second were Jewish martyrs. Now, I looked for Buddhist and Hindu martyrs, but I found none. At least those who didn't kill themselves for a cause, but were killed by a state or leaders of other religions or philosophical movements. It's as if religious martyrdom is almost exclusively a Judeo-Christian phenomenon. Now, the word martyr comes from the Greek word meaning witness. Witness. It originally didn't have a connotation with death, but early Christian witnesses to the faith were being killed by the state. And so the word took on a different meaning, a religious witness killed for their faith. Now, the first recorded martyr in Christian history, besides Jesus himself, of course, is Stephen. Stephen's defense of his faith before the Sanhedrin, Jerusalem's supreme rabbinic court, which accused him of blasphemy, so enraged his Jewish audience that he was taken out of the city and stoned to death. His final words of prayer were one of forgiveness for his attackers. They echo those of Jesus's words on the cross. Stephen said, "Lord, do not hold this sin against them." Now that sounds like a wonderful example of gracious nobility before the hands of one's enemies. And yet, listen to some of the things Stephen said to his killers before he was taken out to be stoned. This is from the book of Acts, chapter 7 in the Christian Bible. He said to them, "You stiff-necked people, uncircumcised in heart and ears, you're forever opposing the Holy Spirit, just as your ancestors used to do. Which of the prophets did your ancestors not persecute? They killed those who foretold the coming of the righteous one. And now you have become his betrayers and murderers. You are the ones who received the law as ordained by angels, and yet you have not kept it. Well, like we discovered about Giordano Bruno's brazen outspokenness last week, Stephen seemed to have asked for it. He certainly didn't do himself any favors. Now, this next martyr is actually quite remarkable in that he is credited with ending the gladiatorial fights in Rome once and for all. The date is well known. January 1st, 404 CE. Saint Telemachus was an Eastern monk who traveled to Rome. And there he heard about the gladiatorial fights in which men fought to the death. Such barbarism appalled Telemachus, so that one day he went to the games. The church historian Theodore, bishop of Cyrus in Syria, first told the story in the 5th century in his ecclesiastical history. Theodore tells how Telemachus came to Rome and he saw the gladiatorial games when, after gazing upon the combat from the amphitheater, he descended into the arena and tried to separate the gladiators. The sanguinary spectators, possessed by the demon who delights in the effusion of blood, were irritated at the interruption of their cruel sports and stoned him who had occasioned the cessation. Now, most of us can't relate to gladiatorial fighting, but to make it more relatable, I put this image in. Imagine a saint jumping into the ring at an MMA fight, getting in between the fighters and imploring them to end this useless violence. I can hear a rain of boos from the crowd, perhaps some cups of beer and food thrown at the saint from the crowd. The truth about the outcome of gladiatorial fights in the Colosseum is apparently the crowd had a say in who lived or died. The crowd literally had the power for life or death for some participants with a simple thumb gesture. Pollice verso. They also could shout lugula, lugula, meaning throat, throat. Now, I've heard of a tough crowd, but this takes it to a whole other level. Now, those mauled by wild animals never had the opportunity of the crowds choosing their fate. But Telemachus' interference on the fateful day in 404 CE is said to have ended the brutality once and for all. After some of the crowd rushed down to stone him, the majority of the crowd were moved deeply. And so was the emperor, who officially banned the gladiatorial contest after Telemachus' witness. Now, what of Telemachus' action that led to his death? In your eyes, was he a fool or a hero? Should we laud him or condemn him? Well, consider how many lives were saved because of his actions. But I ask myself, and I ask you, would we have done the same if we were in the stands at the Colosseum that day? Would we have done the same? Well, just as we looked at Raphael's School of Athens and identified two particular martyrs last week, let's look at Michelangelo's Last Judgment in the Sistine Chapel and two martyrs depicted in his grand work. Next to and below Jesus and Mary are several martyrs, and they are all holding the instruments of their torture. Now look down at the very far right at the bottom, far right at the bottom. There is a man holding a bunch of arrows. For those of you going on the art pilgrimage to Italy, you're going to see a lot of this guy. His name is Saint Sebastian. On my last trip to Italy, I saw in nearly every museum I visited a painting of him. Now, the reason he is holding a bunch of arrows is because that is how he was martyred, or at least that is how the Romans tried to martyr him. Sebastian was a soldier who served under Emperor Diocletian in the late 3rd century. Diocletian was one of the few emperors who killed Christians simply for being Christians. One of the few, not most emperors didn't do that. Now, when the emperor discovered one of his soldiers was a Christian, he had him tied to a tree and shot with arrows. These 3 works are all by the early Renaissance master Andrea Mantegna. Now, I like these versions because they show that the Roman archers must have been lousy shots, because if Saint Sebastian survived this onslaught, which he did, then I suppose the archers must have missed every major organ and artery. That's bad shooting. But here's the rest of the story. According to tradition, he was rescued and healed by Irene of Rome. In all versions of the story, shortly after his recovery, he had the audacity to go back to Emperor Diocletian and warn him about his sins and to stop persecuting Christians. After getting over his surprise at seeing Saint Sebastian still alive, Diocletian had him clubbed to death. Now, why was Saint Sebastian such a popular subject for artists during the Renaissance and Baroque period? Well, because he became associated with the protection from the plague or Black Death. Apparently, the plague's boils that seeped blood and pus resembled puncture wounds from arrows. That's at least one theory I found in my research. Now let's look at our second martyr, this time a woman. She is right next to Saint Sebastian, hunched over and looking back up at Christ, and she is wearing a green robe. Do you see her? This is Saint Catherine of Alexandria. She is holding a section of a wheel, a symbol of how she was martyred, or like Saint Sebastian, how the emperor attempted to martyr her. Now, before I go on, I need to point this out because you probably noticed it. Yes, Michelangelo's women were simply muscular men with women's faces. Michelangelo never worked with a female model, at least we don't think so. He only worked with male models. So that's why his women look extremely muscular and manly. The legend of St. Catherine of Alexandria emphasizes her courage and intelligence. She supposedly was also beautiful. And of course, she was a virgin. More on that requirement later. She was of noble origins, and thus she was highly refined and educated. As a young teenager, she had a vision and became a Christian as a result. And when she was only 18 years old, she had the audacity to confront the Roman Emperor Maximus, debated his pagan philosophers, and succeeded in converting many of them to Christianity. Well, the emperor threw her in prison, but not before she converted his empress and the leader of his armies. Well, the emperor then executed her converts, including his empress, and ordered that Catherine be put to death on a spiked wheel. A spiked wheel. The wheel reportedly shattered the moment Catherine touched it. Well, Maximus then had her beheaded. Because Catherine was so learned, she became patron saint of teachers, archivists, libraries and librarians, and all those associated with wisdom. Many scholars believe she may have never even existed, but that's a subject for another day. Now, something that may bother some of you, I have a feeling, who are familiar with Christian martyrs and the Catholic saints in general, is the lack of examples of non-virgins among women saints. It seems a woman being a virgin is almost a necessity for sainthood. But I'm going to offer you two exceptions. Perpetua and Felicity, or felicitas in Latin. They were arrested at the same time around the year 200 CE in Carthage, North Africa. That's modern-day Tunis, Tunisia. Now, Perpetua was recently married, and she too was a well-educated noblewoman in her early 20s when she was arrested. She was also mother of an infant son that she was still nursing. Felicitas, a slave woman imprisoned with her, was pregnant at the time and martyred with her. Pregnant. Now, being a slave, we could surmise that Felicitas was pregnant as a result of rape by her master. According to the historical narrative, 5 people were arrested and executed at the military games in celebration of the emperor's birthday. That's how they did it then. Along with Felicitas and Perpetua, these included 2 free men, Saturninus and Secundulus, and an enslaved man named Revocatus. All of them were Christians, of course. Another man named Saturus voluntarily went before the magistrate and proclaimed himself a Christian. Apparently, he was caught up in martyr fever. Now, can you imagine celebrating our president's birthday by killing people? What a very strange and violent period in Western history. Now, we actually have Perpetua's first-person account, which was published after her death. She kept a diary. It begins with conflict between her and her father, who begs her to recant her Christian beliefs. Perpetua refuses. She then is baptized before being imprisoned, and she described these events in her diary. Her father comes to her 3 times to convince her to sacrifice to the Roman gods and thus save her life. Well, during his first attempt, he becomes angry and tries to physically force her to recant. In his second attempt, he appeals to her sympathy for him and the rest of her family. Well, finally, on the day of Perpetua's trial, her father brings her son, imploring her to have mercy on the child. You may recall that this is similar to the final day of Socrates' life, when his wife and only son visit him. Well, Perpetua shows great pity for her father. He is even beaten with a rod by the guards for his troubles. But listen to this. Perpetua interprets the words of Jesus in Matthew 10:37 literally. Whoever loves father or mother more than me is not worthy of me. And whoever loves their son or daughter more than me is not worthy of me. Those of you studying this painting, I'm not quite sure why Felicitas in the background there is sleeping. Maybe you might have a theory. But back to Jesus' words, apparently they trump the 4th commandment in the Hebrew Bible, which says we are to honor father and mother. In the arena of the Colosseum, Perpetua and Felicitas survive attacks from wild beasts. So gladiators are sent to finish the job. The gladiator assigned to Perpetua hesitates. He can't bring himself to kill her. So Perpetua guides his sword to her neck with her own hand. What do you think about that? Well, for centuries, Perpetua was viewed as a great model of courage and integrity. But today, let me ask you, should Perpetua be considered a hero of her faith or an overzealous fanatic? Does she inspire you, disturb you, or even disgust you? Well, let's move way forward in history to the period of the Reformation. Michael Servetus by all accounts, was a brilliant Renaissance humanist. He was versed in many sciences. Listen to this: mathematics, astronomy and meteorology, geography, human anatomy, medicine and pharmacology, as well as jurisprudence, translation, poetry, and the scholarly study of the Bible in its original languages, Hebrew and Greek. He was also, listen to this, the first European to correctly describe the function of pulmonary circulation. A brilliant guy. But Michael Servetus had one major problem. Although part of the Reformation, he disagreed with one of its most powerful leaders, John Calvin, who ruled Geneva. He disagreed with Calvin, among other things, on the doctrine of the Trinity. Servetus was also against infant baptism. Ooh, how awful is that, right? And worst of all, Servetus directly rejected John Calvin's idea of predestination. Predestination, which declared that God predetermined some souls to hell, regardless of worth or merit. But Servetus argued that God condemns no one who does not first condemn themselves through their thoughts and behaviors. Well, in a letter to a friend, John Calvin wrote, quote, "Servetus has just sent me a long volume of his ravings. If I consent, he will come here, but I will not give my word of protection. For if he comes here, if my authority is worth anything, I will never permit him to depart alive." Well, John Calvin kept his word. After Michael Servetus attended a sermon by Calvin, he's in Calvin's church and listening to him preach. Afterwards, he was arrested and imprisoned. On October 27th, 1553, Servetus was burned alive atop a pyre of his own books. So what lessons can we learn from Servetus' story? That religion itself is a bad idea and always results in unjust violence? That's reasonable. But before answering, let's look at the story of our final martyr. We conclude with someone many of you might be familiar with, Dietrich Bonhoeffer, the German pastor who was part of the resistance against Hitler and the Nazi regime. He lived the truth of his most famous book, The Cost of Discipleship, published in 1937, in which he states, when Christ calls a man, he bids him come and die. The book is now a modern classic. Bonhoeffer was part of the Confessing Church, which staunchly resisted the Nazi dictatorship and its genocidal persecution of the Jews. In April 1943, he was arrested by the Gestapo and imprisoned at Tegel prison for 1.5 years. Later, he was transferred to a concentration camp. He, along with several other conspirators, was accused of plotting to assassinate Hitler. And he was hanged on April 9th, 1945, right when the Nazi regime was about to surrender. What of Bonhoeffer's martyrdom compared with the other examples we've looked at so far? Remember, his actions were also motivated by his religious convictions. They just happened to occur during a time of war and against what everyone considers a regime of pure evil. Does that somehow make him different than the other martyrs motivated by their religious convictions? Was he wise or foolish in your eyes? Well, to help us answer these questions, here's a quote from an opinion piece from the Psychology Today website titled, "Martyrdom, Worst idea ever, by Devi B. Dillard Wright, PhD. I don't actually buy into the idea that religion is the source of most of the violence in the world, which seems to me a facile argument. One can just as easily be a martyr for communism and capitalism, too. It too demands its blood sacrifices on a daily basis. Religious violence is usually intertwined with political and economic factors, and it feeds on other markers of difference, like race and ethnicity. Ethnicity has more to do with religious conflict than many Christians would like to admit. A Christian America is a not so subtle code for a white America. But I do think there's something especially problematic about holding up the ideal of dying for one's faith to be the model which offers or which others should emulate. The point should be to live for one's faith, not to die for it. The quote goes on, I am not one of those intellectuals who takes a giddy pleasure in knocking all things religious, which looks like the same sort of thing that the zealots of all stripes do to each other. I just think that, for the sake of peace in the world, interpersonal and international, the tired martyrdom discourse needs to go. In this messy, grown-up world of ours, there is no pure, guilt-free place from which to stand and accuse. Every ideology has its dark side, its unintended consequences, and that applies both to sacred and secular causes. One of my late teachers, Dr. Otto Maduro, taught me that we must always be cognizant of the negative impact of the ideologies that we espouse, and not just fulminate on the faults of our enemies. And that is much more difficult and valuable discipline than undergoing all of the torments of the world. We'll soak those words in a moment before I move on. Do you resonate with them? Do you agree? Many of us might be quick to agree with Dr. Dillard White that the point should be to live for our beliefs, not die for them. But humor me a moment. Let us think about how we feel every time we tell a lie. Every time we hide from a truth. Think of every time we violate our own integrity. Don't we feel at such moments something die within us? We literally become like zombies, the walking dead, at least for a moment, until time makes us forget our violation. I think a fitting conclusion and one to reflect on in the coming days is this quote from Shakespeare's play, Julius Caesar. A coward dies 1,000 times before his death, but the valiant taste of death but once. It seems to me most strange that men should fear, seeing that death, a necessary end, will come when it will come. Imagine an idea possessing us, an idea so significant, so captivating, so enlivening, so vitalizing that we would die for it. Would such an idea then be evil? Or would it be of the greatest nobility? Just a little food for thought to take with us.